Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's Better Managers Briefing. I'm Anne Franca, the Chief Executive of the Chartered Management Institute, and every Friday at this time, we bring you news and views on the matters that really matter. So today I am delighted to welcome as my guest my old friend and CMI companion, Salman Amin. Salman is chief executive of some of your favorite brands, and I'm sure they've been keeping you company in this crisis. He is the CEO of Pladis, the company behind, among others, McVitie's. So welcome, Salman. It's lovely to have you on today's show.
And thank you for having me.
So, Salman, you are managing a global business with many brands around the world. There are different rules, regulations, levels in this COVID crisis. You're in that key worker food sector, and you're leading hybrid teams that are working both in factories and remotely. So how do you handle the complexity of all of that?
And it's a great question. You know, right at the beginning, back in March, when all of this hit us, we decided that we would establish what turned out to be 4 basic principles. And our philosophy was we'll establish these principles, and then each of our general managers around the world needs to figure out how best to apply them based on the local needs. And the principles that we were very focused on were, first and foremost, to say, priority number 1 is our people and our communities, and there's no debate about that. Second, I wanted to communicate to everyone that we will deal with this and work with this as one Pladis. We are all in this together. Third, for me, transparency and trust have been 2 of my core values for a long time, and I wanted transparency and trust to guide us through this, that we are very clear with all of our colleagues around the world on what we are facing and how will we deal with this together. And last but not least, we said we would be decisive, yet we would plan ahead. And the reasoning behind that was, if you wait for the perfect data to come in, it never comes. It's sort of like waiting for Godot, right? Mm-hmm. And so we needed to make sure that we keep moving forward. And as things change, and if they change, we'll just demonstrate that we will change with them with a high degree of agility. That's one of the things we at Pladis pride ourselves on, is our ability to be agile. So those were the 4 principles we focused on. And frankly, from March till now, in late October, we've continued to execute against those 4 principles, no matter that the actual plans may differ in how we bring things to life from one country to the other.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's really been the key piece for us.
So very principles-based rather than trying to be prescriptive and having one size-fits-all solutions.
Yeah, very much so, Anne, because, you know, if trust and transparency are 2 of our core values, once you've established the principles, you have to trust your teams. If you have put the right people in the right roles, which I'm a huge fan of our teams, then you know that they know what's best for each one of our markets, because they're on the ground, they understand the local conditions, they understand the local regulations, what the governments are wanting you to do, what the communities want you to do, as well as what our colleagues around the world want you to do. But the only thing we would not have compromised on, we haven't, are those 4 basic principles.
That's great. Well, of course, the second wave is now taking hold in the UK and Europe and elsewhere. And how do you and your employees cope with COVID fatigue? And do you think any of the trends that we've seen emerge during COVID, the speed of tech transformation, working from home, the agile decision making you referenced, and the importance of mental health, do you think that these trends will change the way we lead, manage, and work in the future?
It's a fabulous question, and I find myself thinking about this. And if I transport myself back a few months to March, perhaps this was a function of hope over reality. But I honestly thought that we had a sprint ahead of us. That perhaps by the end of the summer, perhaps September or so, we would be through the worst of it. And as we all know, as things have transpired, nothing could be further from the truth. So for me, the way I think of it now is we are now running a marathon. And this marathon is going to continue well into 2021, and then who knows when it ends. So the qualities that are needed in an organization, I think, get transformed very, very quickly. And two of the values that I'm very focused on, one is this idea of resiliency. The other is this idea of empathy. Mm-hmm. And honestly, resiliency for me, I'm not a marathon runner myself, but when I talk to my friends who do run marathons, they'll often speak about the fact that physical training gets you so far, and the last few miles or the last few kilometers are all about mind over matter. Mm-hmm. You have to, because your body wants to give up, but you want to continue for a greater goal, a purpose. So we've been very focused on talking about how do we build resiliency in the organization? How do we demonstrate empathy? How do we try to understand best as we can what each of our 16,000 colleagues is going through around the world? And it's really hard. And this is where technology is not your friend. When you're looking at someone on a screen, you don't really know how they're feeling. You don't really know what they've been through because you can't tell body language. Most interactions with them are transactional. So it's been much harder. And with my senior team, the thing I keep talking to them about is first and foremost, how do we look after each other? And more importantly, how do we look after our teams? How do we find the right language to try and figure out what our teams are facing and feeling and the stresses that they are under, without being in the same room with them, which in most cases is pretty much impossible nowadays. And it's hard. And I think we are at the beginning of it. Time will tell how well we've coped with it. But I think these dual tracks of resiliency and empathy will play a very large role in how successful we are and how do we help as leaders to reduce the stress on our colleagues who are going through, a number of very unique experiences through themselves. And as to your second part of your question on the role of technology, I'm going to buck the trend a little bit. I think technology will be helpful. I think some of these behavior changes will persist, but I'm not one of those folks who believes that technology per se is a panacea for the future. I think we will revert to some sort of a different balance between working in the office and working at home. And we'll need to strike that because I have a hard time understanding how we will build innovation and creativity and relationships purely through technology. Mm-hmm. I think that'll be awfully hard for us to do. So I don't think the book has been fully written yet. It's still evolving. And the most important thing I can do for Pladis is to make sure that what we are doing, we stay agile through that and we are responding and trying to understand what our folks are really looking for and find the right balance, especially once we do come out at the other end of this.
Sure, those are great points. And by the way, if you have a question for Salman, please type it in the chat box and we'll be drawing questions later on. Now, the other thing I know that you mentioned resilience and that people are under a lot of stress. And do you think that the focus on mental health will remain? And have you been putting more attention on that?
Yes, in fact, we've been very focused on mental health, certainly in the UK for some time now. We've partnered with Mind in the UK to learn from them and to drive a number of learnings through our organization. I think the challenges with mental health will just magnify in the coming months and years to come. And our ability to recognize those conditions, our ability to to reach out and make it easy for our colleagues to open up about what they're feeling will be hugely important, not for any other reason except that it's the right thing to do. So we are focused on it. I can't stand here and tell you that we are the last word on it, but this is something we are very actively focused on.
That's great. Well, another area that CMI does a lot of work in, as you know, is diversity. And our evidence and evidence from McKinsey and others shows that despite some more inclusive working practices, such as greater flexibility about where you work, COVID has hit women and minorities hardest, and it risks the progress, albeit slow, that we have made thus far. In your view, how can we accelerate diversity for women and ethnic minorities despite the pandemic? And what do you think your role is as CEO?
Yeah, it's one of my personal goals to build fully gender parity, gender equality business in Pladis, as well as additional aspects of diversity and inclusion. And I'll share with you how I think about it. Mm-hmm. I too just recently, actually early this morning, read a new report that came across my desk that a recent survey has found that women are 4 times more likely to have been adversely impacted by COVID than men, which is, even if it's approximately right, is a hugely disconcerting factoid. Now, as I look into the future, for me, there are a couple of things we must do. COVID or no COVID, we have to be incredibly clear on what goals we are setting. We have to be incredibly clear on how we're going to measure progress, no matter how long COVID progresses or we are out of this. And my role is to make sure I'm setting the right conditions for success. I'm putting the right goals in. We are evaluating country by country, level by level, what goals do we want to be addressing? How am I charging my senior team and cascading through that? What I expect them to do? How do we track that and measure that relentlessly going forward? And that's part of my job, to make sure folks understand why this is important for us. My other point to you would be, I'm actually a big believer that inclusion precedes diversity. Mm-hmm. To build an inclusive company, an inclusive culture, makes it much easier to have a diverse company. Mm-hmm. And so changing a culture, or helping a culture to understand any culture, what does inclusion mean in practice? It's an easy word otherwise, but what does it mean when we say we actually practice being an inclusive culture? Is a journey. And it's a journey we've only recently started, but it's a journey we're committed to. I believe that as we build a more inclusive culture, it becomes a ton easier to then talk about diversity, because we are just a group of people who are truly open, who listen, not just hear people. And we are much more open to diverse opinions.
That's such a key point, and it relates also to the point around empathy that you raised earlier. One of the key first steps toward building an inclusive culture is to lead with empathy, and of course to listen. Both really important. And then, of course, you have to set the targets and measure, as you said. So some great steps there. Now, of course, I mentioned you have some of the best loved brands here in the UK. I know everybody loves McVitie's. How has COVID changed the relationship that you see between your consumers and your brands?
So certainly in the first few months of COVID, we've seen a fairly significant shift from out-of-home to in-home consumption, and that benefited our brands. It's good to be market leaders in virtually all of the segments that we compete in. And this is where actually the role of trust comes in. Brands that have built big reservoirs of trust over decades, in the case particularly of McVitie's, it's now 180 years old. And there are not that many brands in the whole world that have prospered for 180 years. And so when stress levels rose, when people were at home, they reached out to their old favorites. McVitie's was one of them. So definitely we had that. But going forward, what we have to then do is we have to continue building that trust, and that between our consumers and our brands. So we have doubled down our focus on innovation. We want to understand what people are looking for. What kind of products would they like to have? And we are continuing to invest behind our brands in the UK, certainly, but frankly, in all of our countries globally.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So being a trusted market leader helped you, and I think I've heard that said, that actually in this crisis, it's exactly what you said. People are reaching for brands that comfort them and that they trust, and those tend to be more established, which obviously is a great place to be. So of course, related to that issue of trust, some people say that the human cost of COVID will lead to a rise in ESG, so environmental and social and governance steps by businesses, with businesses embracing them more and emerging with a greater sense of purpose. Do you agree?
Yeah, completely. Our purpose is a very simple purpose at Pladis, which is promising the world happiness with every bite. Very simple, very straightforward, but it's not just in the act. It's in the experience our consumers have when they interact with our brands. It's the experience our colleagues have when they come to work. It's the experience our stakeholders have when they interact with us. So it's a very diverse set of impacts that ESG has, and we are very focused on that. And I think having a clear purpose not only describes what the company does and its future strategy, but it also explains why the company matters, in this case, Pladis. And I want everyone who interacts with us to understand, how do we go about delivering what we promise every day, every bite, in a socially valuable way.
That's great. Well, what about you personally? How has the pandemic changed your personal leadership style? What have you learned? And what would you advise the managers and leaders listening to this broadcast?
Yeah, well, thank you for asking that too. And this is something I reflect upon a great deal. And you've known me a long time. And if I look back over the last 20, 25 years or so, for sure, my biggest journey has been to become a better listener. And there were times in my career when I would hear people, but I'm not sure I was really listening to people. And as I've been on this journey for the last many years, the last 8 months have really reinforced that. The need to listen, and listen not just through my ears, but through my heart, and really listen to what people mean, not just what they say. And if there's one thing I focused on, is that, because by listening actively, I can understand more deeply and more significantly what is it that my colleagues are looking for example. That certainly allows me to be a lot more agile. It allows us to then change our plans if something we're doing is not working or it's not impacting people the right way. Never be proud to change as things change or you learn new things. And last but not least is this idea of practicing listening and empathy, and listen first and never judge, is the journey I've been on.
I love that. So listen not just with your ears, but with your heart. I think that's a great phrase and very wise. But then again, as you said, I've known you a long time and you have always been very wise. And actually, I think you've always been a pretty good listener. But it's great to know that you're getting an even better listener through the pandemic. And I think I would agree with you. I think that that's something that we all need to do as leaders, is listen more. And hopefully this has created the conditions for us to do that. However difficult these times are. So look, we have some time for questions. Our first question comes from Della. How do you get people in global teams to not only work together, but empathize with the variation in restrictions they face in their lives at the moment?
Yeah, so I would go back to what I said earlier, Della. For me, the challenge initially was asking and working with our leadership team to buy into those 4 principles that I had outlined. And I didn't invent them by myself sitting in a cubicle somewhere. We wrote them down. I have a fantastic senior leadership team, and we discussed it. And we said, are these the core values we want to live by? Do they ring true to you? And do you believe they will ring true to all your colleagues in your country? And by and large, the answer was a resounding yes. And then I said, and I trust you, please tell me how you would like to now execute them in your countries knowing what you do best locally, and how can we, those of few of us who sit, quote, at the center, how can we help you execute those? What materials do you need? What proof points do you need? What support do you need? One of the things we established, actually, must have been week 2 or 3 of the crisis, was we established a fund. And we told all 16,000 colleagues, we've put aside a pot of money. Anyone can tap into this at any time, no questions asked. Just tell us if you or someone in your family is facing hardship. Write to us and we will send a check your way, right? And that was available to all of our countries worldwide. And people could get it, in whatever currency that they're living in, just to help folks do that. And those were those little acts that helped us to move forward with the mission that we are on. And if your mission is truly about happiness with every bite, then you know what? Let's live it and prove it and keep getting better at it.
That's a great example, and a wonderful idea to have a fund for those who need it. Our next question is from Morgan. Are there innovations you've seen this year that particularly impress you? And if so, what are they?
A great question again. Morgan, for me, what I've learned the most this year is how different companies have reacted. And it's less about a given product. It's more about how people have evolved business models differently and rapidly to react to what they're facing. If I think about what companies like Reckitt and others did to ramp up production, what certain alcoholic spirits companies did to devote part of their lines to making hand sanitizers, and how they've reacted differently. And they've changed their supply chains in order to be able to meet the needs. If you remember, in March, April, May, it was almost impossible. It was like liquid gold to get hand sanitizers. And that's one example. It's not that it was a new product, but the ability of the organization to innovate differently through their supply chain was something that I really marveled at.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yes, and all those companies that devoted their lines to making PPE, for example, Burberry, instead of designer jackets, making PPE. So it's a great example. So we have a question here from Tyler. Hello, Salman. How did you manage the messy and sometimes chaotic change that COVID-19 forced upon you at the very start of the pandemic?
So, what we didn't know. And we were just really upfront with all our colleagues. And all I could promise them were the 4 principles. We said we would communicate quickly. Every time something changed, we would talk to you. We said that we would do it frequently, and that's what we did. So honestly, it was taking those 4 principles, communicating often, very, very often, with all our colleagues worldwide. Every time things were changing, we were out there, A, sharing things with them, B, listening to them. Loads of town halls, both with large groups as well as a number of small groups of 15 or 20 people at a time, just so I could listen to the challenges people were facing. And if I could, at minimum, I could lend an ear and share my thoughts. And very often, we could then offer them a solution that Pladis could help them with. Mm-hmm. And that's how we've navigated our way through it. We never knew that we had the ultimate answer. We just promised folks that we would be agile. And one of the values we try to practice at Pladis, and it goes with agility, is this idea of tolerance for ambiguity. Mm-hmm. Because certainty is something we all look for, but very rarely are blessed to have. So if you build a healthy tolerance for ambiguity and you're agile through it and you're transparent with folks that you're talking with. And sometimes if we don't have the answer, we said, not sure we truly know, but we will continue working in this way against these principles. And the better our learning, the more we'll share with you.
So that's a really interesting thing. You mentioned your visibility in town halls. Tell us a little bit more. What did you actually do? How often did you get out there, obviously in virtual mode, often to people?
Yeah, I think, I may get this precisely wrong, Anne, but over the last 7 or 8 months, I think I've had 12 or 14 interactions, something like that, some smaller, some larger. And again, all on the same themes. We always wanted to share with them how the business is performing. so they knew. Because, people worry a lot, like what's going to happen to my job? What's going to happen to, therefore, my livelihood? Are we at risk? Questions like that. So I wanted to offer people a platform so I can address their worries. And we've been very, very fortunate. I kept reiterating to folks that no one's role was at risk, and through the pandemic. Second was, what are we learning? What's working? What's not working? Share that with them. And therefore, all the evolution of working from home, coming into the office, what are we doing to make things COVID compliant? To the extent of we sent out these boxes called emergency rations of biscuits to a number of our colleagues. And it was just
I got one. Yay! Thank you.
So those little things, they just helped.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. A great question here from James. How should middle managers practically influence some of the gender and inclusivity issues you talked about earlier?
I think no matter whether we are entry level, middle level, senior, for all of us, it starts with believe that you're doing the right thing. And it's not about whether someone else agrees with you or not. To me, it's either a core value or it's not. And inclusion, and I would urge everyone to start with inclusion. And there's so many great ways to learn how to be a more inclusive person. And I wouldn't ever say to you that's a journey that ever ends. I think we continue to learn along the inclusion journey. But if A, you believe in it, B, you learned how to be inclusive and are committed to it, one can have those courageous and brave conversations. And sometimes you may be in a group where someone says something which in your gut is inappropriate or is behavior that's inappropriate. Let's speak up. Let's just say, hold on here, time out. So I think small steps over time become big movements. And that's what we have to drive towards.
Yeah, you said something really important there for James, which is if you see somebody maybe unintentionally saying something inappropriate that isn't inclusive, that is clearly biased, call it out, right? I think that is a very important thing you just said there, because only when we call it out can we raise the consciousness of the other person that, what was the impact of that on that person when you said that? Did you see so-and-so's face when you said that? It's making people aware of their own behavior. That's a great step toward inclusivity. And actually, James, another tip for you is, why don't you start with some of the women in your team or some of the minorities in your team and say, how does it feel to be a female and work here? Or how does it feel to be a young Black Muslim woman and work here? Because that's a really good conversation starter. It gets back to what Salman's talking about, listening, really important. So question from Namdi. There's been this buzzword on pivoting in the aftermath of COVID-19. Does this mean anything for the business you oversee? What advice do you have for the use of the buzzword?
Well, I'm not sure what context folks use the word pivoting in this particular aspect. The way I think of it is, if you said to me, are we learning our way through COVID? The answer is an emphatic yes. Are we therefore changing based on the learnings we are having? Yes. Would we like to move faster to apply some of the learnings? Yes. So I prefer to say we want to be an agile organization. We want to be a learning agile organization, and one that is always listening. That's how I would describe what we are focused on at Pladis.
Great. That's a great definition. Another question from Angela. You mentioned tolerance for ambiguity. How do you plan at the moment? Do you have a long-term plan, or are you keeping things more short-term?
Fantastic question. Really appreciate it, actually. We've just finished recently both our strategic plan for the next 3 years as well as our operating plan for 2021. And, my general managers kept saying to me, no, I can't give you a target for next year because things are changing. And that's one of the few things I won't compromise on. We have to be able to do both. We have to be able to chew and, chew gum and walk at the same time. So look, we are fairly clear on what next year is likely to become, to how it evolves. Doesn't mean there won't be unexpected challenges. There always are in every year. Maybe next year is a bit more magnified. But we are creating the conditions where quarter to quarter, if things are beyond the norms of what we would have planned, will I have the room to be agile and shift our goals? Yes, right? So we will keep that level of agility in our planning process. But our goals for, say, by the end of 2023, we are very clear on that. And there may be things that try to throw us off course, but we are trying to think through all the risks that we are looking at. And one of the challenges in an organization is we sometimes get unduly focused on the risks. And as I look to the future, I see more opportunities than I see risks. So as long as that equation is opportunities are greater than risks, we will find a way to manage to get to our goals.
That's absolutely great advice. I'm going to take this last question here from Maurice because it's another great one. Which skills do you value most in your leadership team?
Listening and learning. I have this mantra for myself. The day that I stop learning should be the day the good Lord says, come on up, or whatever. And I think that's a fabulous way for me, certainly, to not be defensive. Because, what tends to happen is we build our plans, we put our heart and soul into things, and along comes someone, a colleague or a manager, and says, oh, I want you to change it. And the whole human reaction is to say, well, what do you mean? I just spent days and hundreds of hours planning something. And my counsel would be, let's first listen. Let's first look at the opportunities. Let's understand where the real differences are truly there. Many times it's about the semantics. Occasionally it's about significant differences. And then that's where we have to engage with each other. And we have to say, well, look, I came to this conclusion based on these. Which ones of the core assumptions are you in a different place? And let's narrow down to where the true differences are. And almost always you learn one thing from each other and you start to converge.
So that is an absolutely great piece of advice to end on. Salman, thank you so much for your time and your wisdom. And I love your phrase, listening from the heart. I'm sure everybody here learned loads from you. And if you've enjoyed today's broadcast and you're interested in joining the CMI community, please click the link on the chat box. That's all from me for this week, and I'll see you again next week. Thank you so much, Salman.
Thank you, Anne.